When a doctor vanishes without a trace, the questions left behind are often more troubling than the disappearance itself. But when that doctor was last seen walking through rows of children's beds, checking small wrists for pulses that grew weaker by the day, and when the only witness to his final moments refuses to speak, the silence becomes deafening. What could a doctor discover in those examinations that would make someone ensure he never shared his findings? And why, decades later, would the mere mention of his name cause elderly survivors to close their doors and pull their curtains tight? In 1870, in the heart of Alabama's cotton country, a man arrived seeking truth. What he found would either be buried with him or buried by him. The difference between those two fates may be the most troubling mystery of all. Dr. Harlan Cross first read the letter on a Tuesday morning in late April 1870, sitting at his modest breakfast table in his Boston apartment. The envelope had traveled far. He could tell by the multiple postmarks, the wear on the edges, the slight water stain on one corner that spoke of rain somewhere along its journey from Montgomery, Alabama to Massachusetts. He recognized the handwriting immediately, though he hadn't seen it in nearly 15 years. Margaret Huxley. The name brought back memories of a different world, a different time. Summer evenings on her father's veranda in Mobile. Discussions about poetry and philosophy. The innocent friendship between a young medical student and a merchant's educated daughter. That was 1855, before everything changed. Before the war that tore the country apart and left scars that still hadn't healed. Cross was 42 now, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many long nights and difficult cases. He'd served as a surgeon for the Union Army, seen horrors that still visited him in dreams, performed amputations in field tents while cannons thundered in the distance. After the war, he'd returned to Boston, established a small practice, and tried to rebuild something resembling a normal life. The letter in his hand suggested that normal life was about to be interrupted. He unfolded the paper carefully. Margaret's handwriting was more hurried than he remembered. The letters pressed hard into the page as if written with urgency. Dear Dr. Cross, I hope this letter finds you well, and I hope you'll forgive the presumption of my writing after so many years of silence. I would not reach out unless circumstances were desperate. But I find myself in a situation where I have nowhere else to turn. After the war, I came to Alabama to teach. I believed I could make a difference in the reconstruction efforts, help the newly freed people build lives for themselves. I've been working at Carver Plantation for the past 3 years, teaching the children of the workers there to read and write. Dr. Cross, something terrible is happening here and no one will listen to me. The children are dying. It started 2 months ago. First it was little Mary, only 7 years old. She grew weak over the course of a week, complained of stomach pains, then died in her mother's arms. Dr. Vaughan from town said it was childhood fever. Then James died, age 9. Same symptoms, same diagnosis. Now 3 more have died and 5 others are showing the same signs. But here's what troubles me most. All the children who've fallen ill work in the same place, the processing shed where Mr. Carver has implemented what he calls revolutionary new methods for treating cotton seeds. I've tried to speak with him about it, but he dismisses my concerns. I went to Dr. Vaughan myself, but he insists there's no connection, that it's merely unfortunate coincidence. I don't believe in such coincidences, Harlan. Forgive the familiarity, but our old friendship emboldens me. These children are being killed by something, and I fear it's something in that shed. But I have no medical training, no authority, no way to prove what I suspect. I need someone who will look at this with a physician's eye, someone who isn't beholden to Mr. Carver's influence, someone I can trust. You're the only person I know who fits that description. I realize this is asking a great deal to travel so far, to involve yourself in Southern affairs when I know your sympathies lay with the Union, but children are dying, and their skin color shouldn't determine whether anyone cares enough to investigate. Please, If there's any chance you can come, I'm begging you. Time is running out. Your old friend, Margaret Huxley. Cross read the letter 3 times, his breakfast growing cold beside him. He thought about his schedule. He had patients who depended on him, appointments already made. He thought about the difficulty of traveling to Alabama, about how unwelcome a northern doctor might be in the heart of the former Confederacy. He thought about the risks, but he also thought about children dying while adults argued about jurisdiction and influence. He thought about the oath he'd sworn, and he thought about Margaret, who must be truly desperate to reach out after so many years. By noon, he'd made arrangements for another doctor to cover his patients. By evening, he'd packed his medical bag and a small trunk with clothes and supplies. By the next morning, he was on a train heading south, watching the spring landscape roll past his window, wondering what he was walking into. The journey took 4 days. The trains were slower now than before the war, the rails still being repaired in places, the stations showing signs of deterioration and neglect. Cross watched the landscape change as he traveled south, the greening hills of Virginia, the red clay of the Carolinas, finally the flat cotton fields of Alabama. When he changed trains in Atlanta, he noticed how people looked at him, his northern clothes, his bearing. Something about him marked him as foreign here. Conversations would quiet when he entered a railway car. Eyes would follow him with a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed hostility. The war might have ended 5 years ago, but here it still lived in people's hearts. Montgomery, in May, was like walking into a wall of heat and humidity. Cross stepped off the train into afternoon sunshine that felt thick enough to swim through. The station was smaller than he expected, with paint peeling from the walls and gaps in the platform boards. A few porters moved about, but the bustling commerce he remembered from before the war was absent. The city felt diminished, like something vital had been drained from it. He hired a buggy to take him to the boarding house Margaret had mentioned in her letter, a respectable establishment on the edge of town, she'd written, where questions wouldn't be asked about a northern visitor. The driver, an elderly black man with white hair and weathered hands, accepted his money but said little during the ride. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, was a thin woman with suspicious eyes who looked Cross over carefully before accepting his payment for a week's lodging. "You're that doctor Miss Huxley was expecting." It wasn't a question. "I am. She was here yesterday, asked me to watch for you. Left a note." Mrs. Patterson produced a sealed envelope from her apron pocket, said you should read it before going out to the plantation. Cross took the envelope, thanked her, and climbed the narrow stairs to his room. It was small but clean. A bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a window that looked out onto the dusty street below. He opened the envelope. "Holland, thank God you've come. I've made arrangements for you to visit the plantation tomorrow. You'll be introduced as a colleague of mine, a teacher from Boston interested in our educational methods. Mr. Carver mustn't know your true purpose. He's already irritated by my questions about the children, and if he knew I'd brought in a doctor specifically to investigate, he'd never allow you access. I'll meet you at the plantation at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. We'll have to be extremely careful. I'll explain everything when I see you. Destroy this letter after reading, M." Cross held the paper over the lamp on the bedside table, watching it curl and blacken, Margaret's words disappearing into ash. He was already being drawn into deception, into a web of secrets and carefully maintained lies. It made him uncomfortable, but he understood the necessity. If Carver Plantation was the source of what was killing the children, then Silas Carver himself might be complicit, whether through knowledge or negligence. Either way, a direct approach would only result in Cross being turned away. He spent the evening walking through Montgomery, getting a feel for the town. The grand buildings from before the war still stood, but many showed signs of neglect. Windows were broken and not repaired. Paint had faded and peeled. Gardens had grown wild. But there were also signs of life returning, shops reopening, people going about their business, children playing in the streets. He stopped at a small restaurant for dinner and overheard conversations at nearby tables, talk of cotton prices, of labor difficulties, of the hated Reconstruction government. One man complained loudly about uppity freed men who don't know their place, and Cross had to force himself to eat calmly, to not react, to remember he was here for a specific purpose and couldn't afford to draw attention to himself. After dinner, he found a small library still operating in what had been a church. The librarian, a young woman with kind eyes, helped him find back issues of the local newspaper. He spent 2 hours reading, learning about the area, about Carver Plantation and its owner. Silas Carver was 48, a widower who'd inherited his plantation from his father in 1859, just 2 years before the war began. He'd served briefly as a major in the Confederate Army, but had been discharged due to injury in 1862 and returned to manage his land. Unlike many plantation owners who'd been ruined by the war and the end of slavery, Carver had apparently adapted quickly to the new reality. He now employed his former slaves as tenant farmers and workers, paying them in scrip redeemable at the plantation store, a system that kept workers perpetually in debt and unable to leave. The newspaper portrayed him as a pillar of the community, an innovator who was helping the South rebuild. There was an article from 3 months ago about new agricultural methods he was implementing. Cross read it carefully. Mr. Silas Carver of Carver Plantation has installed modern equipment for processing cotton seeds, utilizing advanced chemical treatments to prevent spoilage and pest infestation. This innovative approach has drawn interest from agricultural experts across the state and promises to revolutionize cotton production. Mr. Carver states that his new methods have increased his output by 40% while reducing losses to insects and decay. Chemical treatments. Cross's medical training immediately raised flags. He knew that many industrial processes use dangerous substances, arsenic compounds, lead solutions, mercury preparations. If improperly handled, if workers were exposed without protection or understanding of the risks, such treatments could be deadly. He left the library as it closed at 8 o'clock and walked back to the boarding house through streets growing dark. Oil lamps were being lit in windows. Somewhere in the distance he heard singing, spirituals, the haunting melodies that had come from slave churches and persisted in the freedmen's communities. The sound was beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. That night, Cross lay awake in his narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the southern night, crickets and night birds, the occasional bark of a dog, footsteps on the wooden sidewalk below. He thought about the children dying slow deaths while their parents watched helplessly. He thought about Margaret, alone in her determination to help them. And he thought about what he might find tomorrow when he finally saw Carver Plantation for himself. Cross rose before dawn and ate a simple breakfast of grits and ham that Mrs. Patterson served without conversation. He dressed carefully in his most conservative clothes, dark trousers, white shirt, simple vest, nothing that would mark him as pretentious or overly northern. He packed his medical bag carefully, hiding his stethoscope and other instruments beneath books and papers that would support his cover as a teacher. He'd arranged to rent a horse from the livery stable, and by 8 o'clock he was riding out of Montgomery on the road Margaret had described. The morning was already warm, promising another sweltering day. The road wound through countryside that must have been beautiful before the war, rolling hills, stands of pine and oak, fields that had once been productive. Now many of the fields lay fallow or were only partially cultivated. He passed several abandoned houses, their windows empty like blind eyes, their porches sagging. He also passed workers in the fields, men, women, and children working with hoes and shovels, beginning their day's labor. They looked up as he rode by, faces carefully neutral, showing nothing of what they might think about a well-dressed white man riding past while they worked. Carver Plantation announced itself from a distance. Unlike many of the properties he'd passed, this one showed no signs of neglect. The fences were maintained. The fields were fully cultivated. And as he crested a hill, he saw the main house rising in the distance, a grand white structure with tall columns surrounded by oak trees. It looked almost exactly as it must have before the war, preserved like a monument to the old order. But as Cross rode closer, he began to see beyond the impressive facade. Behind the main house, spreading across the landscape, were the workers' quarters. Dozens of small cabins arranged in rows, basic structures that looked barely weatherproof. Beyond those were various outbuildings, barns, storage sheds, and what must be the processing shed Margaret had mentioned, a long, low building with a brick chimney rising from one end. Margaret was waiting for him at the split in the road that led either to the main house or to the workers' area. She stood beside a small cart, dressed in a simple grey dress, her face shaded by a broad-brimmed hat. When she saw him, she raised a hand in greeting. Cross dismounted and approached her. She was thinner than he remembered, with fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. But her eyes were the same, intelligent and determined. "Harlan," she said softly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you came." "Your letter was quite persuasive," Cross replied. "Tell me everything, but tell me quickly before we're in anyone's sight." Margaret's words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for too long. 3 children died in April: Mary, James, and little Daniel. 2 more died last week: Sarah and Thomas's sister, Anna. 5 more are sick now with the same symptoms: weakness, stomach pain, vomiting, and this strange discoloration of the skin. The local doctor insists it's just various childhood ailments. But Harlan, I've seen enough to know it's all the same thing. And every single one of them works in the processing shed. What exactly do they do in that shed? They process cotton seeds, sorting, treating, packaging them for sale. Mr. Carver says he's using a new chemical solution that makes the seeds resistant to insects and mold. He's very secretive about the exact process, calls it a proprietary method. But whatever it is, I think it's poisoning the children. Have you been inside? Once, briefly, when I first arrived at the plantation. I remember the smell. Chemical, harsh. It made my eyes water. Mr. Carver gave me a quick tour, showed me how efficiently the children worked, then ushered me out. I haven't been allowed back since. He says it's for safety reasons, that the chemicals might damage women's constitutions. Her voice carried bitter irony. Cross nodded, filing away the information. And Mr. Carver himself, what kind of man is he? Intelligent, calculating. He presents himself as a progressive employer, better than most in the area. He pays wages, though they're paid in script, only good at his store, which charges inflated prices. He allows me to teach the children, which many planters don't. He speaks about the importance of helping the freed men adjust to their new lives. She paused. But underneath the pleasant words, there's iron. He expects absolute obedience. Workers who complain too much find themselves dismissed, which means evicted from their homes with no references, no way to find work elsewhere. Everyone here is afraid of him. And what will he think of me? I've told him you're a colleague from Boston, interested in our educational efforts in the South. He was pleased by that. Likes the idea of Northern approval of his methods. You'll need to flatter him, I'm afraid. Let him show off his operation. He has considerable pride. Cross remounted his horse, and Margaret climbed back onto her cart. Together they continued toward the plantation, but now they rode in silence, playing their roles as simple teacher and visiting colleague. As they approached the main house, a man emerged onto the front porch. Even from a distance, Cross could feel the force of his presence. Silas Carver was tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He wore well-tailored clothes despite the heat, and his beard was perfectly trimmed. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching their approach with eyes that seemed to take in every detail. "Miss Huxley," Carver called out as they drew near. His voice was deep and cultured, with the distinctive accent of the educated South. "And this must be our visitor from Boston." Cross dismounted and approached the porch, extending his hand. "Dr. Harland Cross, sir, though I'm here in my capacity as an educator rather than a physician. Miss Huxley has told me impressive things about your operation here." Carver's handshake was firm, his eyes sharp as they studied Cross. A doctor turned teacher. An interesting transformation. "The war changes us all, Mr. Carver. I found I had a calling to help rebuild through education rather than continuing in medical practice." The lie came more easily than Cross expected. Miss Huxley's letters about her work here inspired me to see for myself how the South is approaching the education of the freed men. "You'll find we are quite progressive here," Carver said with obvious pride. "Unlike some planters who resist the new order, I've embraced it. I pay wages. I allow education. I'm implementing modern methods that will make this plantation profitable in a way that benefits everyone." He gestured broadly. "Come, let me show you what we've built here." The next hour was a carefully choreographed tour. Carver walked them through the grounds, pointing out improvements he'd made, workers he'd helped find employment, fields that were producing better than before the war. Cross played his part, asking interested questions, taking notes in a small book as if documenting educational approaches. But his eyes were those of a physician trained to observe. He watched the workers they passed, noted the thinness of many, the worn-out clothes, the weariness in their eyes. When Carver wasn't looking, he saw children who should have been in school working in the fields instead. He noticed that while Carver spoke about fair wages, there was no actual money changing hands, only tallies marked in a ledger book. Finally, inevitably, they approached the processing shed. "This is the heart of my operation," Carver announced with unmistakable pride. "My innovation that's putting Carver Plantation at the forefront of modern agriculture." The shed was larger up close than it had appeared from a distance. The walls were solid wood, darkened by weather and time. There were a few small windows set high in the walls, and Cross noted immediately that they were all closed despite the heat. The door was heavy, with a substantial lock. "I employ mostly children here," Carver explained. "Not because I wish to exploit youth, you understand, but because the work requires small, nimble fingers, and the wages they earn help support their families." He produced a key and unlocked the door. "The chemicals we use are quite valuable, so security is necessary." Cross's heart beat faster as the door swung open. This was it. This was where the children were dying. "Yes, sir. Been working there since last November. Mr. Carver, he pays good wages for that work. We need the money with 3 children and my mama to feed." Cross heard the defensiveness in her voice, the guilt. She knew something was wrong, but was trapped between needing the income and watching her son sicken. "I'm not judging you, Ruth," Cross said gently. "You're doing what you must to survive. But I need to know, does Thomas come home with his hands stained from the work? Does his clothes smell of chemicals?" "Yes, sir. The stains don't wash out no matter how hard I scrub. And the smell," she paused, "it's harsh. Makes my nose burn when I wash his clothes." "Does he ever mention feeling sick while working? Headaches, dizziness, nausea?" Ruth looked at Margaret, then back at Cross. "Sometimes he says the air in the shed makes him feel strange, but he keeps working because he's a good boy. Wants to help the family." Cross felt the weight of it. This child, barely 9 years old, working 6 hours a day in a toxic environment because his family needed 50 cents a day. Knowing he felt sick, but pushing through because his mother, his grandmother, his siblings depended on that meager income. "Ruth, I need you to trust me. I'm not just a teacher. I'm a physician, and I think Thomas is very sick because of something in that shed. I think the chemicals they're using are poisoning him and the other children who work there." Ruth's eyes widened. She looked at Margaret, who nodded confirmation. "Can you help him?" Ruth asked, her voice breaking. "Can you make him better?" "I can try, but the most important thing is that he stops working in that shed immediately. No more exposure to those chemicals." "But Mr. Carver, he'll be angry if Thomas just stops showing up. He might dismiss us, turn us out. I'll handle Mr. Carver, Cross said with more confidence than he felt. Right now, Thomas's life is more important than anything else. Will you keep him home? Ruth looked at her son, then slowly nodded. Yes, sir. I'll keep him home. Cross left some basic medicines. Bismuth for the stomach upset, iron tonic for the anemia, instructions for forcing fluids. He knew these were only palliatives, that the real treatment was removing the source of poisoning. But it was something. They visited 4 more families that afternoon. The pattern was identical each time. Children who worked in the processing shed, now sick with the same constellation of symptoms: weakness, abdominal pain, vomiting, the characteristic grey pallor and bluish extremities. Families desperate for help but terrified of losing their livelihoods. Trust had to be built slowly, carefully, before they'd speak openly. By the time the sun began to set, Cross had examined 8 children in various stages of arsenic poisoning. He documented everything carefully, taking notes that would serve as evidence. But he'd also seen the human cost, the fear in mothers' eyes, the exhaustion of children who should have been playing but instead lay listlessly in their beds, the grinding poverty that made every decision a calculation of survival. He and Margaret walked back toward the main house in silence, both too overwhelmed to speak immediately. Finally, Margaret said, "What do we do now? You have your evidence. What's the next step?" Cross stopped walking and looked back toward the processing shed, its chimney silhouetted against the darkening sky. "I need to get inside that shed again, at night when no one's there. I need samples of that chemical solution. Documentation of exactly what's being used. The examinations prove the children are sick, but I need to prove definitively what's causing it. That's incredibly dangerous. If you're caught, I know. But without that proof, Carver can keep claiming it's just unfortunate coincidence. With it, we can force the authorities to act." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I can get you a key. Sarah, the housekeeper. She's troubled by what's happening. She's kept her own records, seen the pattern. I think she'll help us. Then we do it Sunday, when the shed is empty and Carver is at church in town." "Sunday," Margaret agreed. "God help us." The next 2 days were a delicate dance of deception. Cross continued his role as visiting educator, sitting in on Margaret's classes, meeting with more families, always observed by Carver's watchful eyes. But at night, in his room at the boarding house, he compiled his medical notes into a comprehensive report, documenting the pattern of illness among the children who worked in the processing shed. On Saturday evening, Margaret brought someone to meet him at the boarding house, an older black woman with silver hair and intelligent, sad eyes. This was Sarah, the plantation's housekeeper, who had served the Carver family for over 30 years, first as a slave, now as an employee. They met in Cross's small room, speaking in low voices. Sarah sat on the single chair while Cross and Margaret stood. "Miss Margaret says you're trying to help the children," Sarah began without preamble. "Says you're a real doctor, that you think you know what's killing them." "I do," Cross replied, "and I need your help to prove it." Sarah reached into the bag she carried and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "I've been keeping records since the new shed opened last November. Wrote down everything I saw, everything I heard." Cross took the journal reverently and began to read by lamplight. Sarah's handwriting was careful and clear, each entry dated and detailed. November 10th, 1869. The new tanks arrived today, big metal things that took 4 men to carry into the shed. Mr. Carver was excited, said this would change everything. November 15th. The children started working in the shed, 12 of them. Mr. Carver showed them how to handle the seeds, dip them in the solution, lay them out to dry. Said they had to be careful, that the chemicals were valuable, but he didn't give them gloves or nothing to protect their hands. November 28th. Little Mary complained her hands hurt. They were stained black and she said they burned. Her mama washed them, but the stains wouldn't come out. December 20th. Several children looking poorly. Mr. Carver says it's just winter weakness. that they need more food, but they all work in that shed. January 15th, 1870. Mary is very sick now. Can't hold down food. Dr. Vaughan came, said it's fever, but I don't think that's right. Something's wrong. February 3rd. Mary died last night. Her mama is heartbroken. That's the second child gone since December. Both worked in the processing shed. February 12th. I asked Mr. Carver if maybe the chemicals could be making the children sick. He got angry, told me to mind my own business, that I don't understand modern agricultural methods. March 8th. More sick children. James is the worst now. Same symptoms as Mary had. The vomiting, the gray skin, the fingertips turning blue. April 2nd. James died today. I can't keep silent anymore. But who would listen to me? Who would believe an old black woman over Mr. Silas Carver? The entries continued, page after page of careful observation, documenting the gradual realization that something was terribly wrong. Sarah had noted not just the illnesses, but also Carver's responses, his dismissal of concerns, his insistence that the work continue, his anger when questioned. "This is extraordinary documentation," Cross said quietly. "Sarah, you've been recording evidence that could save lives." "Could save lives, or could get me dismissed," Sarah replied. "I'm too old to find other work easy, but I'm also too old to go to my grave knowing I stayed quiet while children died." She looked at him intently. "Miss Margaret says you plan to go into the shed tomorrow, get proof of what's in those tanks. I'm giving you this journal. Use it however you need to. Just make it stop." "I will," Cross promised. "But I want you to know when this comes to light, Carver will know someone gave us access, shared information. There could be consequences." "I know. I'm ready for that." Sarah stood, preparing to leave. "Just promise me one thing, Doctor. Don't let their deaths be for nothing. Don't let those children be forgotten." After Sarah left, Cross and Margaret sat together, the journal between them. Margaret spoke first. "This changes things. With your medical documentation and Sarah's records, we have a complete picture. Even if we can't get samples from the shed, this might be enough." "It might be," Cross agreed. "But I still want to get those samples. Physical evidence that can be analyzed, that proves exactly what's in those tanks. It will be irrefutable. Then we do it tomorrow, as planned. Sarah left a key for me. It's a copy of the shed key made last year when they had the locks redone. Mr. Carver doesn't know she kept it." Cross nodded, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. Breaking into the shed was illegal, could result in arrest if they were caught. But children were dying, and sometimes the law moved too slowly to save lives. "Tomorrow, then. What time does the family leave for church?" 8 o'clock. They'll be gone until at least 1 in the afternoon. Services are long, and then they usually have Sunday dinner in town. That gives us 5 hours, more than enough time. I'll ride out at 9, meet you near the shed." They finalized the details. Then Margaret left for the night. Cross spent the next several hours reading and rereading both his notes and Sarah's journal, preparing himself for what was to come. He fell asleep finally near midnight, the journal still in his hands, and dreamed of children with gray faces and blue fingers reaching out to him from darkness. Sunday morning dawned clear and hot, promising another sweltering day. Cross dressed in old clothes. If they encountered chemicals, he didn't want to ruin his good garments. He packed his medical bag carefully with empty vials for collecting samples, notebooks for documentation, and a basic medical kit in case something went wrong. Mrs. Patterson looked at him oddly as he left the boarding house so early on a Sunday morning, but she said nothing. Cross had learned that she asked few questions, which was why Margaret had recommended this particular establishment. He rode slowly toward Carver Plantation, watching for the family's departure. From a distance, concealed in a grove of trees, he saw the elegant carriage pull away from the main house. Silas Carver, his 2 adult children, and what appeared to be an elderly aunt, all dressed in Sunday finery, heading to town for services at the Episcopal Church. Cross waited a full 30 minutes after they disappeared from view, making certain they weren't returning for something forgotten. Then he urged his horse forward, circling around to approach the shed from the direction of the workers' quarters, where he'd be less visible from the main house. Margaret waited where they'd arranged, near a large oak tree that provided some shade. She looked pale but determined. "Any problems?" Cross asked quietly as he dismounted. "No. Sarah's in the main house. She stayed behind claiming illness, so she's the only one there. She'll watch and warn us if anyone unexpected comes. The workers are all in their quarters or at their own church services. We should be undisturbed." They approached the shed quickly. The area was eerily quiet. No sounds of work, no voices, just the buzz of insects and the distant call of birds. The shed seemed larger and more ominous in the stillness. Margaret produced the key with shaking hands. It took her 2 tries to get it into the lock, fear making her clumsy. Then the lock turned with a heavy click, and the door swung open. The smell rolled out to meet them, that harsh chemical odor, even stronger than Cross remembered. Without the noise and activity of workers, the shed felt like a tomb, dark and close and heavy with threat. Cross lit the lantern he'd brought, casting dancing shadows across the interior. "Stay near the door," he told Margaret. "Keep watch, and if you see anyone coming, call out immediately. I need you to be my eyes while I work." Margaret nodded, positioning herself where she could see both into the shed and out across the grounds. Cross moved deeper into the building, his lantern held high. In the daylight silence, he could examine everything more carefully. The work tables were covered with a fine powder, gray-green in color. He ran his finger through it and examined the residue. Definitely metallic, with the characteristic texture of an arsenate compound. He took out a clean handkerchief and carefully collected a sample, folding it and tucking it into a vial. He moved to the drying racks where treated seeds were laid out. They were coated in the same gray-green substance. Another sample collected. Then he approached the tanks. These were the heart of the operation, where the real danger lay. There were 3 of them, each about 4 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, made of what appeared to be cast iron. The metal was heavily corroded in places, eaten away by whatever chemicals they contained. Cross set down his lantern carefully and opened the lid of the first tank. The odor was overwhelming, this close, acrid, metallic, making his eyes water. He forced himself not to breathe deeply, taking shallow breaths through his mouth. The liquid inside was dark, almost black, with a thickness that suggested high concentrations of dissolved solids. An oily sheen covered the surface. Cross took out a glass vial and carefully dipped it into the solution, collecting a sample. His hands were steady despite his racing heart. As he sealed the vial, he noticed something, a barrel near the tanks, partially hidden behind some wooden crates. He moved closer and found it bore a partial label. The writing faded but still partially legible. He made out Paris green, copper ace to arsenite, poison, handle with protective gear, Paris green. One of the most toxic arsenic compounds known, used as a pesticide and wood preservative. And here it was, being used to treat cotton seeds that children handled with bare hands, in an enclosed space with no ventilation, for 6 hours a day. Cross felt cold fury settling in his chest. This wasn't ignorance or accident. The label clearly stated the substance was poison, clearly specified protective gear should be used. Carver knew, or should have known, exactly how dangerous this was. He collected samples from all 3 tanks, documented everything in his notebook, made careful sketches of the setup. He was so focused on his work that he almost didn't hear Margaret's urgent whisper. "Harlan, someone's coming." Cross's head snapped up. "Who? The family can't be back yet." "Not the family. Someone on horseback, coming fast from the direction of town." Cross grabbed his samples and his bag and moved quickly toward the door. They couldn't be caught here. The consequences would be disastrous. But even as he reached Margaret, he heard the horse arriving, heard the rider dismount. They had seconds to decide, try to hide inside the shed or face whoever was coming. Cross made a choice. "We don't hide," he said quietly. We're here with good reason. Let me handle this." The figure that appeared in the doorway blocked out the sunlight, a large man, backlit so his features were initially unclear. Then he stepped forward into the light from Cross's lantern, and Cross recognized him with sinking heart. Silas Carver stood in the doorway, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "I had a feeling," Carver said, his voice dangerously calm, "a feeling that something wasn't right about our visiting teacher. So I didn't go to church this morning. I sent my family ahead and doubled back, watched from a distance. And here you are, breaking into my property, stealing my trade secrets." Cross straightened, refusing to show fear. "I'm not stealing anything, Mr. Carver. I'm gathering evidence that your operations here are killing children." "Evidence?" Carver's laugh was harsh. "You're a trespasser and a thief. The sheriff will be very interested in this." "Then let's call the sheriff," Cross replied. "Let's show him these chemicals you're using. Let's show him the children dying of arsenic poisoning. Let's have a full investigation of your innovative methods." Something shifted in Carver's expression. For a moment, uncertainty flickered behind his eyes. Then it hardened into calculation. The question was so direct, so honest, that Cross felt his throat tighten. He wanted to lie, to offer false hope, but this child deserved truth. "I think so, son. I'm very sorry." Thomas nodded slightly, as if he'd already known. "Will you tell my mama? Tell her it wasn't her fault. She blames herself for making me work there." "I'll tell her. But Thomas, it wasn't her fault. She did what she had to do to take care of you." "I know." The boy's eyes were drifting closed again. "Tell Mr. Carver. Tell him." But whatever Thomas wanted to say was lost as he slipped back into unconsciousness. 20 minutes later, with the first light of dawn showing through the cabin's cracks, Thomas took his last breath. Ruth's wail of grief echoed through the workers' quarters. Other women came, offering what comfort they could, the ancient ritual of shared mourning, of community gathering around loss. Cross stood back, feeling the weight of failure crushing down on him. He stepped outside the cabin into the growing light. The sun was rising, indifferent to human suffering. Somewhere in the main house, Silas Carver was likely still asleep, comfortable in his bed, while a child he'd employed lay dead in a cabin barely fit for animals. Cross felt something crystallize inside him, a decision made not through careful reasoning, but through moral certainty. He would not make a deal with Carver. He would not trade justice for convenience, no matter how pragmatic that might seem. Some things were simply wrong, and no amount of economic justification could make them right. But he also wouldn't wait for the slow wheels of legal justice to turn. He would do something else, something that might cost him everything, but that might actually save lives. He didn't share his plan with Margaret when she emerged from the cabin hours later, didn't tell her what he intended. She deserved deniability if things went wrong. "I'm going to meet with Carver," was all he said. "Tomorrow at noon, like he demanded. And we'll see what happens." Cross spent that final morning making preparations. He wrote a detailed report of everything he'd found, including references to Sarah's journal and his own medical observations. He addressed a package to the Freedmen's Bureau in Montgomery, to the Army Corps of Engineers, to the Federal Marshal. Inside, he placed copies of his notes, samples of the chemicals he'd collected, and a letter explaining the situation in detail. He gave the package to Mrs. Patterson with explicit instructions. "If I don't return by Tuesday, mail this. Not before. If I do return, I'll take it back." Then he rode out to Carver Plantation one last time, arriving at the main house exactly at noon. A servant showed him to Carver's office, a wood-paneled room lined with books and ledgers, a massive desk dominating the space. Carver sat behind the desk, fingers steepled, expression neutral. Dr. Cross, I'm glad you decided to be reasonable. Do you have what I asked for? I do, Cross said. He placed Sarah's journal on the desk, followed by his sample vials, followed by his medical notes. Everything is here. Carver's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. A wise choice. I'll have my lawyer draw up an agreement. I'm not finished, Cross interrupted. I'm giving you these materials because I've realized you're right. Legal proceedings would take too long, might accomplish nothing, so instead, I'm offering you a different arrangement. Carver leaned back, intrigued despite himself. What arrangement? You will immediately cease all use of Paris green and any other arsenate compounds in your processing operations. You will provide proper ventilation in that shed. You will never employ children under the age of 14 in any processing work. You will provide medical care for all children currently suffering from arsenate poisoning. And you will establish a compensation fund for the families of children who have died, and in exchange, I will remain silent. I won't go to the authorities. I won't publish my findings. I'll return to Boston, and you'll never hear from me again. Carver studied him for a long moment. You expect me to believe you'll just walk away? After everything you've said about justice, I expect you to understand that I care more about saving living children than punishing you. Sometimes we have to compromise our principles for the greater good. Isn't that what you told me? Using my own words against me. Clever. Carver stood and moved to the window, looking out over his plantation. And how would I know you'd keep your word? That you wouldn't take my agreement and still report me? You wouldn't know, Cross admitted. You'd have to trust that I'm a man of my word, just as I'd have to trust that you'd actually implement the changes you promise. The room was silent except for the ticking of a large clock on the wall. Finally, Carver turned back. Very well, I agree to your terms. The changes will begin immediately. Put it in writing. A letter outlining every commitment you're making. Carver's eyes narrowed. You said you'd remain silent. I will. But I need documentation, not for the authorities, for myself. Proof that we had this agreement in case you ever try to claim otherwise. Carver hesitated, then moved to his desk and pulled out paper. For the next 30 minutes, they negotiated the exact wording of the agreement. When it was finished, Carver signed it with a flourish. There, our bargain is sealed. He held out his hand for Cross to shake. Cross looked at the offered hand for a long moment, then shook it, feeling the weight of what he was agreeing to. Remaining silent while a man who'd caused children's deaths faced no legal consequences. Trusting promises from someone who'd shown he valued profit over lives. But also, possibly, saving the children who were still alive, still working in that shed. I'll be leaving Alabama tomorrow, Cross said. But I'll be checking on this plantation. I have contacts who will report to me. If I find you violated any part of this agreement, our deal is void, and everything I know goes directly to federal authorities. Understood. And Cross, get out of Alabama. You're not welcome here. Cross left the office carrying nothing. He'd left all his evidence with Carver, as agreed. He mounted his horse and rode slowly away from the plantation, not looking back. But he didn't ride toward Montgomery. Instead, he circled around through the woods to the workers' quarters, where Margaret was waiting, as they'd arranged. Did you do it? She asked. I did. But Margaret, you need to leave Alabama too. Tonight. Go back to Philadelphia. Carver knows you helped me, and I don't trust what he might do once I'm gone. What about you? I'll be leaving too. But I have one more thing to do first. The official documentation about what happened next is sparse and contradictory. Here is what can be verified. On May 23, 1870, Dr. Harlan Cross was seen leaving Carver Plantation at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Multiple witnesses observed him riding his horse toward the main road. He appeared calm and unhurried. At 3 o'clock that same afternoon, one of Carver's workers found an abandoned medical bag on the side of the road, approximately 1 mile from the plantation. The bag was open, its contents scattered, but there was no sign of Dr. Cross or his horse. At 5 o'clock, Margaret Huxley arrived at the Montgomery Sheriff's Office to report that Dr. Cross was missing. She stated that he'd been supposed to meet her at her boarding house at 4 o'clock, but never arrived. She was worried something had happened to him. A search was organized. They found Cross's horse 2 days later, grazing peacefully in a field 5 miles away, still saddled. But of Cross himself, there was no trace. The investigation continued for 2 weeks. Theories abounded. He'd been attacked by bandits. He'd fallen into the river and drowned. He'd simply abandoned his possessions and fled back north under an assumed name. Some suggested foul play, looking meaningfully at Silas Carver, but there was no evidence, and Carver had an ironclad alibi. He'd been meeting with his lawyer in Montgomery at the time Cross disappeared, with multiple witnesses to confirm it. Margaret Huxley left Alabama 3 days after Cross's disappearance. She boarded a train north carrying only a small case and was never seen in Montgomery again. Sarah remained at Carver Plantation, but those who knew her said she seemed to age overnight, becoming quiet and withdrawn. She continued her work, but stopped keeping her detailed journal. Whatever she knew or suspected, she kept to herself. Interestingly, changes did begin appearing at the plantation in the weeks following Cross's disappearance. The processing shed was thoroughly ventilated. New windows were cut. Fans were installed. Work shifts were shortened. Children under 14 were reassigned to other tasks. And gradually, over the course of the summer, the use of Paris green was phased out in favor of other preservation methods. The deaths stopped. The children who'd been sick began slowly to recover. No official explanation was ever given for the changes, and Silas Carver never publicly acknowledged that there had been any problem with his previous methods. In June 1870, a letter arrived at the Freedmen's Bureau in Montgomery. It was unsigned but contained detailed documentation of health and safety violations at Carver Plantation. An investigation was opened, but Carver was able to demonstrate that he'd already corrected all the issues mentioned in the letter. The matter was closed with no charges filed. In late June, a package addressed to Dr. Harlan Cross was returned to sender from his Boston address, marked recipient unknown. The package had originated from Montgomery and contained a legal document, the agreement Cross had negotiated with Carver, along with a note in handwriting no one could identify. The note said only, "The work continues. The children are safe. Let that be enough." Years passed. The story of the disappeared doctor became one of those local mysteries that people speculated about but never solved. Some said Carver had him killed and buried somewhere on the vast plantation. Others insisted Cross had staged his own disappearance, possibly to start a new life somewhere else. A few romantics suggested he'd fallen in love with Margaret Huxley and they'd run away together to start over where no one knew them. The truth, whatever it was, remained buried. Silas Carver lived until 1889, dying of a heart attack at age 68. He was buried with honors, remembered as a successful businessman and landowner. His obituary made no mention of dead children or unsafe working conditions. History, as written by those in power, was kind to him. But there were other records, kept by other people, that told different stories. Ruth, Thomas's mother, remained at Carver Plantation for 3 more years before moving to Montgomery, where she found work as a laundress. She lived until 1914, and in her final years, she often spoke about the doctor who came from the north and tried to help us. She never mentioned Cross's name. Perhaps she'd forgotten it, or perhaps she'd deliberately chosen not to remember, protecting him even in memory. "He did something important," she would say to her grandchildren. "Don't know exactly what, but after he came, things got better. The shed got safer, children stopped dying. Sometimes that's all we can ask for, that someone tried, and that it made a difference." Sarah's story had a stranger ending. She remained at Carver Plantation until 1912, when she died at the age of 76. On her deathbed, attended by family members, she reportedly spoke at length, though her words were often confused and difficult to understand. But several people present swore she kept repeating, "He knew. had to disappear, couldn't stay. They'd have killed him too. When asked who she was talking about, she apparently looked directly at one of her daughters and said, "Clear as day, the doctor." He understood. Some fights you can't win in the light. Had to go into the shadows to keep fighting. What she meant by that, no one could explain. And Sarah, exhausted by the effort of speaking, closed her eyes and died within the hour. Margaret Huxley never returned to Alabama. Records show she lived a quiet life in Philadelphia, teaching at a school for freedmen's children. She never married, never sought public attention. In 1895, she published a small book of essays about education and social reform. One essay, titled "The Cost of Compromise," examined the moral complexities of choosing between principle and practical results, between pursuing justice through proper channels that might fail and accepting imperfect solutions that might save lives. The essay never mentioned Carver Plantation or Dr. Cross by name, but those who knew her story recognized the references. She wrote, "Sometimes the greatest sacrifices are those made in silence. The reformer who speaks publicly and is martyred for their cause becomes a hero, remembered by history. But what of those who work in shadows, who make compromises that stain their souls in order to achieve results that save lives? These people are often forgotten, or worse, condemned by those who don't understand that sometimes survival requires us to dirty our hands with deals we'd prefer not to make. I knew such a person once. I don't know what became of them, but I know that because of choices they made, choices I might not fully understand even now, children lived who otherwise would have died. Is that not its own form of heroism? What really happened to Dr. Harlan Cross? The question haunted the few people who knew the full story and lived long enough to reflect on it. Was he murdered by Carver or Carver's agents, his body hidden so well it was never found? This seemed most likely to many, a northern doctor who threatened a powerful planter's interests. The motive was clear, the means were available, and the historical record was full of such disappearances. But if he was murdered, why would Carver then implement exactly the reforms Cross had demanded? Why risk drawing attention by making changes that essentially admitted there had been a problem? It made no strategic sense. Did Cross fake his own disappearance, perhaps realizing that remaining in Alabama made him a continued target? Did he scatter his belongings to make it look like foul play, then slip away to start a new life under a different name? This would explain why his body was never found, why there were no further sightings, but it required believing he'd abandon his medical practice, his reputation, his entire life, and never reach out to anyone he knew again. Or was there some third possibility, something more complex that involved the agreement he'd made with Carver, the letter that arrived at the Freedmen's Bureau, the changes that were implemented, and his convenient disappearance that made it impossible for Carver to ever claim Cross had violated their agreement by going public? In 1923, a lawyer in Montgomery who'd been handling the estate of Silas Carver's grandson made an interesting discovery. Among old papers stored in a bank vault was a sealed letter with instructions that it was to be opened only upon the death of the last person involved in the matter of May 1870. Since no one living knew what that referred to, and since all principals involved had been dead for years, the lawyer opened the letter. Inside was a document in Silas Carver's handwriting, dated August 1870, 3 months after Cross's disappearance. It read, "Let the record show that Dr. Harlan Cross came to Alabama with noble intentions and departed having achieved his goals, though not in the manner he anticipated. I initially viewed him as a threat, to be eliminated or discredited. I underestimated his dedication and his intelligence. He understood, better than I gave him credit for, that sometimes reform must be purchased at the cost of revolution, that sometimes the reformer must step aside to allow the reform to take root. Our agreement stands, though he is no longer here to hold me to it. I will continue the changes he demanded, because despite myself, I have come to see their wisdom. The loss of workers to illness was hurting productivity more than the cost of safety measures. His disappearance solved a problem for both of us. It removed him from danger while also removing me from the threat of his testimony. Whether he lives somewhere under a new name, content with what he accomplished, or whether he met some other fate, I do not know and do not wish to know. Let him remain a mystery. But let it also be recorded that he did more good in his brief time here than most men accomplish in a lifetime. And he did it by understanding when to compromise and when to disappear. The lawyer who found this document didn't know what to make of it. He eventually donated it to the State Historical Society, where it remained largely unnoticed for decades.